Hi guys, tonight we're diving deep into the shadows of medieval history, exploring stories that your history textbooks probably skipped over. We're talking about the dark side of medieval royalty, the brutal realities behind the glittering crowns and magnificent castles. This isn't about fairy tale princes and princesses. This is about real people who wielded absolute power and the devastating consequences that followed. We'll uncover the twisted world of political marriages where love meant nothing and alliances meant everything. We'll explore how royal courts became breeding grounds for corruption, where gold changed hands in dark corners and justice was bought and sold like any other commodity. You'll hear about succession disputes that tore kingdoms apart, brother fighting brother, children plotting against parents, all for the chance to sit on a throne built on bones and blood. We'll reveal the intricate web of political intrigue that surrounded every medieval court, where spies lurked in every shadow and a whispered word could mean the difference between life and death. Tonight's journey will take us through centuries of royal brutality, examining how the pursuit of power corrupted even the most well-intentioned rulers, and how the common people paid the ultimate price for their sovereign's ambitions. From the blood-soaked halls of England to the treacherous courts of France, from the scheming palaces of the Holy Roman Empire to the war-torn kingdoms of medieval Europe, we'll witness how absolute power truly does corrupt absolutely. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was an era where power was absolute and mercy was rare. To understand the dark side of medieval royalty, we must first grasp the fundamental nature of power during this time. Unlike modern democracies with their checks and balances, medieval kings and queens ruled by divine right, believing themselves chosen by God to wield absolute authority over their subjects. This belief system created a perfect storm for abuse, corruption, and brutality that would define royal courts across Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The concept of divine right meant that questioning a king's authority wasn't just treason against the state, it was heresy against God himself, punishable by torture and death. Royal power in medieval times was built on 3 primary pillars: military might, religious authority, and economic control. Kings commanded armies of knights bound to them by feudal oaths, controlled vast networks of clergy who preached obedience from every pulpit, and owned the majority of productive land in their kingdoms. This concentration of power in the hands of a single individual, often someone who inherited their position through accident of birth rather than merit or competence, created an environment where abuse was not just possible but inevitable. The royal court became a microcosm of this power structure, where courtiers, nobles, and clergy all competed for the monarch's favor, knowing that a single word from the crown could elevate them to unimaginable wealth or condemn them to poverty and death. The isolation of royal power also played a crucial role in enabling the dark behaviors we'll explore tonight. Medieval kings and queens lived in a bubble of luxury and flattery, surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on keeping the monarch happy. Truth became a commodity too dangerous to trade in freely. When surrounded by sycophants and yes-men, even well-intentioned rulers could lose touch with reality, becoming convinced of their own infallibility and developing an appetite for ever greater displays of power and control. This isolation bred paranoia as well, as rulers became increasingly suspicious of potential threats, real or imagined, leading to purges, executions, and the creation of elaborate spy networks that would make modern intelligence agencies seem amateur by comparison. The feudal system itself was designed to concentrate wealth and power upward, creating a pyramid structure where each level owed absolute loyalty to the level above. At the top of this pyramid sat the king or queen, who owned everything and everyone within their realm. Peasants were literally owned by their lords, who in turn owed everything to their king. This system meant that royal whims could impact millions of lives instantly. A king's desire for a new castle could mean crushing taxation for an entire region. A queen's political marriage could lead to decades of foreign influence and cultural suppression. The arbitrary nature of royal power meant that subjects lived at the constant mercy of their ruler's mood, personality, and personal desires. What made medieval royal power particularly dark was its intersection with primitive concepts of justice and punishment. Kings were not just political leaders, but also the ultimate judicial authority in their realms. They could order executions, tortures, and confiscations based on suspicion alone, with no appeal process and no higher authority to check their decisions. The concept of individual rights simply did not exist. People were property of the crown, to be used, taxed, conscripted into armies, or disposed of as the monarch saw fit. This judicial power was often used not to maintain order or protect the innocent, but to eliminate rivals, seize property, and intimidate potential opposition into submission. The religious authority wielded by medieval monarchs added another layer of darkness to their power. Kings and queens didn't just rule by political authority, but claimed to be God's representatives on earth, making rebellion against them tantamount to rebellion against divine will. This religious dimension meant that royal brutality was often cloaked in the language of righteousness and divine justice. Massacres became crusades, political executions became holy punishments, and territorial expansion became sacred missions blessed by heaven itself. The intertwining of royal and religious authority created a system where questioning the monarch's actions was not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damning, effectively silencing moral opposition to even the most heinous royal crimes. Political marriages in medieval times were perhaps one of the most systematic forms of human trafficking ever institutionalized by royal courts. Unlike modern marriages based on love and mutual consent, medieval royal unions were purely transactional arrangements designed to consolidate power, forge alliances, and expand territorial control. Young nobles, often children barely into their teens, were traded like commodities between royal houses with no regard for their personal wishes, compatibility, or even basic human dignity. These arrangements frequently involved girls as young as 12 being married off to men old enough to be their grandfathers, all in service of political ambitions that treated human beings as mere pawns on a giant chessboard of international relations. The case of Isabella of Valois exemplifies the brutal reality of political marriages. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed to Richard II of England as part of a peace treaty between England and France. By age 7, She was married and living in a foreign court, speaking a foreign language, surrounded by strangers who viewed her primarily as a symbol of alliance rather than as a human child. When Richard was deposed and murdered, the 11-year-old widow became a political liability, shuffled between various potential suitors like a piece of property whose value fluctuated with changing political winds. Her childhood was sacrificed on the altar of diplomatic necessity, and her story was repeated thousands of times across medieval Europe as royal families used their own children as bargaining chips in their endless games of power. The psychological trauma inflicted by these political marriages extended far beyond the immediate victims. Children raised in royal households grew up knowing they would never have control over their own romantic destiny, that their bodies and futures belonged not to themselves, but to the political calculations of their parents and advisors. This knowledge created a generation of nobles who viewed marriage as purely transactional, who learned from an early age to suppress their own desires and emotions in service of dynastic goals. The emotional stunting produced by this system created rulers who were often incapable of forming genuine human connections, viewing relationships only through the lens of political utility and personal advantage. Royal women bore the brunt of this system's cruelty, expected to produce male heirs regardless of their health, age, or personal circumstances. The pressure to birth sons led to countless pregnancies in dangerous circumstances, with women dying in childbirth at alarming rates as they attempted to fulfill their primary function as royal breeding stock. Catherine of Aragon endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths in her desperate attempt to provide Henry VIII with a male heir, suffering years of physical and emotional agony while being blamed for failures that were largely beyond her control. When she finally failed to produce the desired son, she was cast aside, her decades of loyal service counting for nothing against her inability to fulfill her biological obligation to the crown. The international implications of political marriages often proved devastating for entire populations. When marriages failed to produce the expected political benefits, or when circumstances changed and alliances shifted, the consequences rippled outward to affect millions of ordinary people. The marriage of Henry VI of England to Margaret of Anjou was intended to bring peace between England and France, but instead contributed to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that devastated England for decades. The personal incompatibility between Henry and Margaret, combined with the political tensions their union failed to resolve, helped tear the kingdom apart in a series of bloody battles that left thousands dead and the monarchy itself in ruins. Political marriages also served as tools of cultural imperialism, forcing conquered or allied peoples to accept foreign rulers who often had little understanding of or respect for local customs and traditions. Foreign queens and kings imposed their own cultural practices, languages, and religious observances on their new subjects, sometimes leading to cultural suppression and social upheaval that lasted for generations. The marriage alliances that brought Norman rulers to Sicily, German emperors to Italy, and Spanish monarchs to the Netherlands all resulted in cultural conflicts that sparked rebellions, religious persecution, and the systematic destruction of local traditions that had existed for centuries. Perhaps most disturbing was how the system of political marriages normalized the concept that human beings, particularly women, were essentially property to be traded for political advantage. This mindset infected not just royal courts, but permeated down through the nobility and into broader society, reinforcing systems of oppression and control that kept entire populations subjugated. The casual way in which medieval chroniclers described young girls being given in marriage to seal treaties reveals how thoroughly dehumanized these arrangements had become, reducing complex human beings to simple diplomatic tools whose personal suffering was irrelevant compared to the political benefits their unions might bring. The children produced by political marriages often suffered their own unique form of trauma. Raised in households where their parents were essentially strangers, bound together by political necessity rather than love or even friendship. Royal children frequently grew up in courts filled with tension and resentment, where their mothers were isolated foreigners struggling to adapt to hostile environments, and their fathers viewed the marriage as a political burden to be endured. This toxic family dynamic produced generations of emotionally damaged royals who perpetuated the cycle of political marriages, viewing their own children as future diplomatic assets rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. The documentation of resistance to political marriages provides some of the most heartbreaking stories in medieval history. Chronicles tell of young women who refused to eat, attempted to escape, or even tried to take their own lives rather than submit to unwanted political unions. These acts of desperate rebellion were typically met with increased surveillance, physical restraint, and sometimes brutal punishment designed to break their will and force compliance. The systematic crushing of individual agency in service of political goals reveals the essentially predatory nature of medieval royal power, which consumed its own children as readily as it devoured the lives of common subjects. Some political marriages resulted in decades-long Cold Wars between spouses who despised each other but were forced to maintain a public facade of unity. These relationships poisoned entire royal courts, creating atmospheres of tension and suspicion where courtiers had to navigate between hostile factions centered around the feuding royal couple. The marriage of Louis VII of France to Eleanor of Aquitaine exemplified this dynamic, with their mutual incompatibility and Eleanor's strong personality clashing with Louis's religious devotion and political conservatism. Their eventual annulment led directly to Eleanor's marriage to Henry II of England, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Western Europe and contributing to centuries of conflict between England and France. The economic implications of political marriages often proved as devastating as their personal costs. Dowries and marriage settlements frequently bankrupted royal treasuries, forcing monarchs to impose crushing taxes on their subjects to pay for diplomatic weddings that brought little tangible benefit to the kingdom. The elaborate ceremonies and celebrations surrounding royal marriages consumed resources that could have been used to improve infrastructure, defend borders, or alleviate poverty. Instead, going towards spectacles designed primarily to impress foreign dignitaries and demonstrate royal wealth and power. Even successful political marriages that achieved their diplomatic objectives came at enormous human cost, normalizing a system that treated people as property and emotions as irrelevant luxuries that rulers could not afford. The few documented cases of political marriages that developed into genuine affection between spouses were exceptions that proved the rule, celebrated precisely because they were so rare in a system designed to subordinate human happiness to political calculation. Court corruption in medieval royal households reached levels that would make modern organized crime syndicates seem like amateur operations. The concentration of wealth and power in royal courts, combined with the absence of any meaningful oversight or accountability, created environments where bribery, embezzlement, and fraud became not just common, but essential survival skills for anyone hoping to advance their position or even maintain their current status. The sheer scale of medieval court corruption was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that up to 70% of royal revenues were diverted into private pockets before reaching their intended destinations. This systematic theft wasn't conducted in secret, but operated as an open system where everyone understood that official positions came with unofficial opportunities for personal enrichment that often exceeded legitimate salaries by factors of 10 or 20. The elaborate networks of kickbacks and reciprocal favors that characterized medieval court corruption created shadow economies that operated parallel to official government functions, with complex webs of obligation and mutual benefit that ensured corrupt practices were self-perpetuating and virtually impossible to eliminate. A single corrupt transaction often involved dozens of participants, each taking their share while ensuring that everyone else remained complicit in the overall system. Royal treasurers paid inflated prices to suppliers in exchange for personal kickbacks. Suppliers provided substandard goods while bribing inspectors to approve their deliveries. And inspectors shared their illicit gains with supervisors, who ensured that no investigations would threaten the profitable arrangements that benefited everyone involved except the crown and its subjects. Court positions became hereditary not through official policy, but through the practical reality that corrupt office holders used their ill-gotten wealth to purchase positions for their children, creating dynasties of corrupt officials whose families maintained their privileged status across generations through systematic theft from royal treasuries. These hereditary corruption networks became so entrenched that they developed their own internal codes of conduct, training programs for new members, and sophisticated methods for hiding their activities from occasional reform efforts. The sons and daughters of corrupt officials grew up understanding that government service was primarily a business opportunity rather than public duty, entering their inherited positions with detailed knowledge of established corruption practices and existing networks of cooperative criminals. Royal officials, from lowly clerks to high-ranking ministers, understood that their official salaries were merely starting points for the real business of extracting wealth from their positions through various forms of corruption that became so institutionalized they were practically considered legitimate perks of office. The normalization of corruption created environments where honest officials were viewed as naive or dangerous rather than admirable, with their integrity posing threats to established systems that benefited everyone else. Officials who refused to participate in corrupt practices found themselves isolated, undermined, and eventually forced out of their positions by colleagues who viewed their honesty as a form of betrayal that threatened everyone's illicit income streams. The development of specialized corruption roles within medieval courts created elaborate hierarchies of criminal activity that paralleled official government structures, with corruption specialists who focused on particular types of theft and fraud, while maintaining careful coordination to avoid conflicts that might expose their activities. Master embezzlers who controlled major revenue streams worked closely with document forgers who created false records to hide their activities, while bribery coordinators managed complex networks of payments that ensured cooperation from potential whistleblowers and investigators. These corruption specialists often possessed more detailed knowledge of government operations than legitimate officials, understanding exactly where money flowed, how decisions were made, and which officials could be bought or intimidated into cooperation. The international dimensions of court corruption created diplomatic crises as corrupt officials routinely sold state secrets, military intelligence, and strategic information to foreign powers in exchange for personal enrichment that often exceeded their lifetime earnings from legitimate government service. Royal ambassadors maintained secret bank accounts in foreign countries. Royal military commanders provided enemy forces with detailed information about defensive capabilities and strategic plans. And royal advisors shared confidential diplomatic correspondence with anyone willing to pay for the information. This systematic betrayal of national interests created security vulnerabilities that often proved more dangerous than military threats, as kingdoms found themselves unable to maintain secrets or execute strategies because their own officials were actively working for enemy powers. The corruption of royal record-keeping systems meant that medieval governments often operated based on completely fictional information, with official documents bearing little resemblance to actual circumstances, capabilities, or resources. Financial records showed non-existent revenues while hiding massive expenditures. Military reports claimed troop strengths that existed only on paper. And diplomatic communications presented fabricated versions of international relationships that served corrupt officials' interests rather than accurate assessments of political realities. This systematic falsification of information made effective governance virtually impossible, as royal decision-makers found themselves working with data that had been manipulated by corrupt subordinates pursuing their own agendas. The sale of royal offices was one of the most systematic forms of corruption plaguing medieval courts. Positions that carried significant power and the opportunity for further corruption were literally auctioned off to the highest bidder, with no consideration given to the purchaser's competence, integrity, or suitability for the role. This system meant that crucial government positions were filled not by qualified administrators, but by wealthy individuals whose primary goal was to recoup their investment and generate profit from their purchased authority. Tax collectors, judges, military commanders, and diplomatic officials all understood that their positions were business investments expected to generate substantial returns through various forms of graft and abuse of power. The manipulation of royal justice for financial gain transformed medieval courts into elaborate extortion rackets, where legal outcomes were determined not by evidence or law, but by the size of bribes offered to royal officials. Wealthy criminals could literally purchase pardons for their crimes, while innocent people of modest means found themselves convicted of fabricated charges because they lacked the resources to buy justice. The concept of equal treatment under law was completely alien to medieval royal courts, where different scales of justice applied depending on an individual's ability to pay for favorable treatment. This corruption of the judicial system meant that royal courts became instruments of oppression rather than protection for ordinary subjects. Royal treasuries became personal piggy banks for monarchs and their favorites, with public funds routinely diverted to finance private luxuries, personal vendettas, and grandiose vanity projects that served no public purpose beyond satisfying royal egos. Kings and queens treated their kingdom's wealth as personal property, spending vast sums on elaborate palaces, exotic imported luxuries, and extravagant entertainment, while their subjects struggled with crushing poverty and inadequate public services. The concept that royal resources should serve the public good was virtually non-existent, replaced by the assumption that kingdoms existed primarily to finance royal lifestyle and ambitions. The practice of selling royal privileges and exemptions created a system where wealthy individuals and institutions could literally purchase immunity from laws that applied to everyone else. Royal charters exempting particular groups from taxes, military service, or legal jurisdiction were sold to the highest bidders, creating a two-tiered system of citizenship where money could buy freedom from civic obligations and legal accountability. These purchased privileges often lasted for generations, creating hereditary classes of individuals who owed their special status not to merit or service, but to their ancestors' ability to bribe royal officials centuries earlier. Military corruption reached staggering proportions, with royal armies becoming elaborate schemes for embezzling public funds rather than effective fighting forces. Military commanders routinely filed false reports about troop numbers, keeping wages for non-existent soldiers, while actual fighters went unpaid and undersupplied. Equipment purchases provided endless opportunities for kickbacks and overcharging, with weapons and supplies of inferior quality purchased at premium prices through corrupt procurement deals that enriched suppliers and military officials while leaving soldiers vulnerable on the battlefield. The widespread nature of military corruption meant that medieval armies were often far weaker than they appeared on paper, creating strategic vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The Church's integration into royal administration created unique opportunities for religious corruption that combined spiritual authority with temporal power in particularly toxic ways. Bishops and abbots who served as royal officials often used their religious positions to legitimize corrupt practices, claiming divine authority for actions that were purely motivated by greed and personal ambition. The sale of religious offices, known as simony, became so common in royal courts that spiritual leadership positions were treated as investment opportunities rather than sacred trusts. This corruption of religious authority undermined both church and state, creating institutions that served private interests rather than their stated spiritual or civic missions. Diplomatic corruption transformed international relations into elaborate criminal enterprises where ambassadors and envoys routinely took bribes from multiple parties, selling state secrets and diplomatic intelligence to whoever offered the highest price. Royal envoys often maintained secret financial relationships with foreign powers, providing classified information about their own kingdom's military capabilities, financial resources, and strategic plans in exchange for personal enrichment. This systematic betrayal of national interests by royal officials meant that medieval diplomacy was often conducted by individuals whose primary loyalty was to their own bank accounts rather than their sovereign or country. The royal household itself became a breeding ground for petty corruption, as servants, guards, and court officials developed elaborate schemes for stealing from the crown while maintaining plausible deniability. Food meant for royal banquets was diverted to private sales, valuable objects disappeared from royal collections to be sold in distant markets, and even basic supplies like candles, cloth, and soap became targets for systematic theft by household staff who viewed such pilfering as informal supplements to their official wages. The scale of household corruption meant that royal inventories were often fictional documents bearing little resemblance to actual available resources. Tax collection became the most lucrative form of royal corruption, with collectors routinely demanding payments far exceeding official rates and pocketing the difference for themselves. The complexity of medieval tax systems, combined with widespread illiteracy among taxpayers, created perfect conditions for systematic overcharging and fraud. Tax collectors often invented entirely fictional obligations, threatening imprisonment or property confiscation for non-payment of taxes that existed only in the collector's imagination. This corruption of the tax system meant that royal revenues were significantly less than what subjects actually paid, with the difference disappearing into the personal accounts of corrupt officials. Royal licensing and regulation systems became elaborate extortion schemes where merchants, craftsmen, and other professionals were forced to pay regular bribes to royal officials simply to continue their legal businesses. The proliferation of licenses, permits, and regulations created endless opportunities for officials to demand payments for services that should have been routine administrative functions. Businesses that refused to pay these informal taxes found themselves subjected to harassment, excessive inspections, and fabricated violations that could result in fines, closure, or even criminal charges. The corruption of royal record-keeping meant that even the basic functions of government became unreliable as officials routinely falsified documents, destroyed inconvenient records, and created fabricated histories to serve their personal interests or those of their patrons. Land records, financial accounts, legal precedents, and diplomatic agreements were all subject to manipulation by corrupt officials who understood that controlling information meant controlling power. This systematic falsification of official records meant that medieval governments often operated based on fictional information, making effective policymaking virtually impossible. Succession disputes in medieval kingdoms were among the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in human history, tearing apart entire civilizations as royal families turned on each other with a savagery that makes modern civil wars seem like polite disagreements. The absence of clear, universally accepted rules for royal succession created a system where every royal death triggered a potential crisis that could escalate into decades of warfare, devastation, and social collapse. These conflicts weren't merely political disputes, but existential struggles where failure meant not just loss of power, but torture, execution, and the complete destruction of entire family lines. The stakes were so high and the rules so unclear that succession crises brought out the absolute worst in human nature, turning blood relatives into mortal enemies willing to commit any atrocity to claim the throne. The War of the Roses in England exemplified the catastrophic nature of royal succession disputes, demonstrating how competing claims to the throne could literally tear a kingdom apart for generations. What began as a relatively minor dispute over whether the House of Lancaster or York had the stronger claim to the English crown escalated into a brutal civil war that lasted over 30 years and resulted in the deaths of most of England's high nobility. Fathers fought against sons, brothers killed brothers, and the normal bonds of family loyalty dissolved completely as different branches of the royal family pursued their competing claims with increasingly desperate violence. The conflict became so vicious that it effectively destroyed the traditional English nobility as a class, with entire family lines wiped out in the fighting or executed in the purges that followed each shift in royal power. The practice of child rulers created particularly vulnerable situations that corrupt nobles and ambitious relatives exploited with ruthless efficiency. When kings died, leaving minor heirs, the resulting power vacuum inevitably triggered fierce competition for control over the child monarch, with different factions understanding that whoever controlled the young ruler effectively controlled the kingdom. These regency disputes frequently resulted in the systematic elimination of rival claimants, including the murder of children whose only crime was having royal blood that made them potential threats to their guardian's power. The case of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's most notorious examples of how succession disputes could lead to the casual elimination of inconvenient children, with 2 young boys disappearing into the London Tower never to be seen again, almost certainly murdered by relatives who viewed them as obstacles to their own ambitions. Religious succession disputes added an extra dimension of horror to these conflicts, as competing claimants sought to legitimize their causes by portraying their rivals as heretics or enemies of God. The intersection of royal succession with religious authority meant that these conflicts often took on the character of holy wars, with each side claiming divine support for their cause and portraying their enemies as spiritual as well as political threats. This religious dimension provided justification for particularly brutal tactics, including the massacre of entire populations suspected of supporting rival claimants, the systematic destruction of religious sites associated with enemy factions, and the torture and execution of clergy who refused to endorse particular succession claims. The international complications of succession disputes often transformed domestic conflicts into continent-wide wars as foreign powers intervened to support claimants who promised favorable treatment in exchange for military assistance. These interventions typically prolonged and intensified succession conflicts, as local disputes became proxy wars between major European powers pursuing their own strategic objectives. The 100 Years' War between England and France began essentially as a succession dispute over the French throne, but escalated into a generational conflict that devastated both kingdoms and established patterns of mutual hostility that lasted for centuries. Female succession created particularly complex and violent disputes, as medieval legal systems provided conflicting and often contradictory rules about women's rights to inherit royal power. The question of whether kingdoms could pass to daughters, whether married women could rule independently, and whether children could inherit through their mothers rather than fathers, created endless opportunities for competing claimants to challenge established successions. These disputes were often especially vicious because they challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and political authority, leading to conflicts that were as much about social revolution as political succession. The practice of dividing kingdoms among multiple heirs created systematic conditions for succession warfare, as brothers and cousins found themselves ruling adjacent territories with overlapping claims and conflicting interests. The Frankish tradition of dividing royal inheritance among all sons guaranteed regular succession wars, as the resulting kingdoms inevitably came into conflict over borders, resources, and prestige. These fraternal wars were often the most brutal of all succession conflicts because they combined personal family hatred with political ambition, resulting in conflicts where normal restraints on royal warfare completely disappeared. Illegitimate children posed constant threats to established successions, as royal bastards often enjoyed popular support and could challenge the legitimacy of their half-siblings' claims to the throne. The ambiguous legal status of illegitimate royal children meant that succession disputes could emerge generations after the original births, as changing political circumstances made previously dismissed bastard lines suddenly viable alternatives to unpopular legitimate rulers. William the Conqueror's conquest of England began essentially as a succession dispute based on his claimed legitimacy as heir to Edward the Confessor, demonstrating how illegitimate royal children could reshape entire civilizations through their pursuit of throne rights. The role of royal wives and mothers in succession disputes often proved as destructive as the ambitions of male claimants, as queens and queen mothers pursued their children's interests with a ruthlessness that matched any male competitor. These women often proved more dangerous than male rivals because they were underestimated by their enemies and could operate behind the scenes while maintaining public facades of feminine respectability. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent decades manipulating succession politics to advance her son's interests, ultimately helping to trigger conflicts that reshaped the political landscape of Western Europe and established patterns of English-French rivalry that lasted for centuries. The elimination of rival claimants became a standard practice in succession disputes, with successful usurpers routinely ordering the execution of anyone with potential claims to their throne, including distant relatives, former supporters of rival factions, and even clergy who had provided religious legitimacy to competing claims. These purges often extended far beyond immediate threats, as new rulers sought to eliminate entire family lines that might produce future claimants. The systematic nature of these eliminations meant that successful succession disputes often resulted in the near extinction of royal bloodlines, fundamentally altering the genetic and cultural composition of ruling dynasties. The economic devastation caused by succession disputes often proved more destructive than the immediate violence, as competing claimants financed their campaigns through increasingly desperate taxation and resource extraction that left their kingdoms impoverished and vulnerable to foreign invasion. The costs of maintaining armies, purchasing mercenary support, and building alliances meant that succession wars often consumed multiple generations' worth of accumulated royal wealth, leaving victorious claimants ruling over kingdoms that had been stripped of resources and reduced to shadows of their former prosperity. The psychological trauma inflicted by succession disputes on surviving royal family members created generations of rulers who were paranoid, ruthless, and incapable of trusting even their closest relatives. Growing up in environments where family members regularly murdered each other for political advantage produced monarchs who viewed violence as the normal response to political disagreement and who treated their own children as potential threats rather than beloved offspring. This psychological damage ensured that succession disputes became self-perpetuating cycles of violence, as traumatized rulers created conditions that guaranteed future conflicts among their own heirs. Political intrigue in medieval royal courts reached levels of sophistication and brutality that would make modern intelligence agencies seem like amateur operations, with every conversation potentially carrying hidden meanings and every relationship serving multiple purposes beyond their apparent functions. The concentration of absolute power in the hands of monarchs, combined with the high stakes of court politics, where favor could mean immense wealth and disfavor could mean torture and death, created environments where espionage, assassination, and betrayal became essential survival skills that were passed down through generations of courtiers like family trades. The architecture of medieval palaces was specifically designed to facilitate intrigue and surveillance, with hidden passages, secret chambers, and carefully positioned listening posts that allowed spies to monitor conversations throughout the royal residence. These physical infrastructure investments revealed how systematically medieval courts were organized around the assumption that everyone was potentially plotting against everyone else, with even the most trusted advisors understanding that their private conversations might be overheard by rivals or royal agents seeking information that could be used for blackmail or political advantage. The recruitment and training of court spies became a specialized profession that attracted individuals from all social classes, with successful intelligence operatives often rising from humble origins to positions of great influence through their ability to gather and manipulate information that served royal interests. These spy networks operated sophisticated training programs that taught operatives how to assume false identities, extract information through seemingly casual conversation, create and maintain complex webs of deception, and eliminate targets through methods that appeared accidental or natural. The most successful court spies often operated for decades without their true roles being discovered, building reputations as loyal servants or trusted friends while secretly serving intelligence masters who rewarded their efforts with wealth and protection. The development of coded communication systems allowed medieval conspirators to coordinate complex plots across vast distances while maintaining plausible deniability if their messages were intercepted by rival intelligence networks. These encryption methods often involved multiple layers of concealment, with messages hidden within apparently innocent business correspondence, diplomatic communications, or even religious texts that could be read on multiple levels depending on the reader's knowledge of particular decryption keys. The sophistication of medieval cryptography often exceeded the capabilities of the authorities attempting to intercept and decode suspicious communications, creating communication security that allowed complex conspiracies to operate for years without detection. The use of sexual relationships as intelligence tools created elaborate networks of romantic espionage where beautiful and charming agents of both sexes were deliberately placed in positions where they could seduce targets and extract crucial information during intimate encounters. These romantic intelligence operations often required years of careful preparation, with agents developing detailed background stories, acquiring specialized knowledge about their target's interests and preferences, and receiving training in seduction techniques that combined physical attraction with psychological manipulation. The most successful romantic spies often formed genuine emotional attachments to their targets, creating complex psychological situations where professional duties conflicted with personal feelings in ways that sometimes resulted in spectacular betrayals or the exposure of entire intelligence networks. The manipulation of religious authority for intelligence purposes created unique opportunities for espionage that combined spiritual credibility with political access, as priests, confessors, and religious advisors could gather information under the cover of providing spiritual guidance and moral counsel. Medieval courts often competed to place their intelligence operatives in religious positions around rival monarchs, understanding that religious advisors often enjoyed more intimate access to royal thoughts and fears than political counselors or military commanders. These religious intelligence operations were particularly effective because they exploited the medieval belief that spiritual advisors were bound by religious vows that prevented them from revealing confidential information, creating perfect cover for intelligence gathering that appeared to be protected by divine authority. The development of elaborate disinformation campaigns became crucial elements of court intrigue as different factions worked to plant false information that would mislead their enemies while concealing their own actual plans and capabilities. These disinformation efforts often involved the creation of entirely fictional intelligence reports, the deliberate leaking of fabricated plans designed to misdirect enemy preparations, and the systematic spread of rumors that would damage rivals' reputations or create divisions within enemy coalitions. The sophistication of medieval disinformation required careful coordination among multiple agents who needed to maintain consistent false narratives while avoiding contradictions that might expose their deceptive efforts. The international dimensions of court intrigue created complex webs of espionage that crossed national boundaries, with royal courts maintaining spy networks in foreign kingdoms while simultaneously defending against foreign intelligence operations within their own territories. These international intelligence wars often involve the recruitment of foreign nationals who could operate more effectively in enemy territory, the establishment of cover businesses and organizations that provided legitimate reasons for maintaining presence in foreign countries, and the development of communication systems that could function across hostile borders despite official diplomatic tensions between kingdoms. The concentration of absolute power in the hands of monarchs, combined with the high stakes of court politics, where favor could mean immense wealth and disfavor could mean torture and death, created environments where espionage, assassination, and betrayal became essential survival skills. Every royal court became a battlefield where wars were fought with whispered words, forged documents, and hidden daggers rather than open armies. The complexity of these intrigues often involved multiple layers of deception, with spies spying on other spies, double agents serving triple masters, and elaborate schemes that could take years to unfold and often backfired spectacularly on their creators. The development of royal spy networks transformed medieval courts into paranoid surveillance states where no conversation was private and no relationship was genuine. Kings and queens maintained elaborate intelligence operations that infiltrated every level of society, from peasant villages to rival royal courts, gathering information that could be used to prevent rebellions, blackmail enemies, or gain advantages in diplomatic negotiations. These spy networks often operated with virtually unlimited budgets and complete freedom from legal constraints, employing methods that included torture, blackmail, sexual entrapment, and murder to achieve their objectives. The existence of these networks meant that royal subjects lived under constant surveillance, never knowing whether their neighbors, servants, or even family members might be reporting their activities to royal agents. The practice of planting spies in rival courts created a complex web of international intrigue where ambassadors, merchants, clergy, and noble visitors all potentially served multiple masters. Medieval diplomatic missions were often elaborate espionage operations disguised as legitimate state business, with envoys gathering intelligence about military capabilities, economic resources, political divisions, and personal secrets that could be exploited for strategic advantage. The systematic nature of this diplomatic spying meant that international relations were conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and deception, where treaties were signed while both parties actively worked to undermine each other through covert operations. Royal mistresses and lovers often served as unwitting intelligence assets, providing access to intimate information about monarchs' private thoughts, fears, and plans that could be exploited by rival factions. The sexual relationships of medieval rulers became matters of international strategic importance, with foreign powers actively working to place their agents in royal beds to gain access to state secrets. These romantic espionage operations often involved elaborate, long-term seductions that could take years to develop, with beautiful and charming agents cultivating relationships with royal targets while secretly reporting their findings to enemy masters. The manipulation of royal succession through intrigue reached staggering levels of complexity, with various factions working to eliminate rival claimants, discredit legitimate heirs, and position their preferred candidates for throne inheritance. These succession intrigues often involved forged documents claiming to prove illegitimate births, fabricated evidence of treason or heresy, and elaborate schemes to arrange accidental deaths of inconvenient royal relatives. The Battle of Bosworth Field, which ended the War of the Roses, was as much the result of years of intrigue and betrayal as military prowess, with Richard III's defeat coming partly because his supposed allies had been secretly negotiating with Henry Tudor for months before the battle. Religious intrigue added another dimension to court politics, as different factions sought to control royal religious advisors and manipulate monarchs' spiritual beliefs for political advantage. The influence of confessors, chaplains, and religious advisors over medieval rulers created opportunities for various parties to shape royal policy through spiritual manipulation. Competing religious orders, foreign powers, and domestic political factions all worked to place their agents in positions of religious authority around monarchs, understanding that someone who could claim to speak for God potentially wielded more influence than military commanders or political advisors. The use of poison as a political weapon became so common in medieval courts that rulers routinely employed food tasters and maintained extensive precautions against assassination attempts through contaminated food or drink. The development of increasingly sophisticated poisons, often derived from rare plants or mineral compounds, created a shadow industry of professional poisoners who served various political factions. The constant threat of poisoning created atmospheres of extreme paranoia around royal meals, with elaborate protocols for food preparation and testing that turned simple dining into complex security operations. Court astrologers and fortune tellers often served as covers for intelligence operations, using their positions as royal advisors to gather information while providing seemingly supernatural guidance that was actually based on carefully collected intelligence about political and military developments. The medieval belief in astrology and prophecy created perfect opportunities for spies to operate under religious or mystical covers, gathering information while claiming to divine the future through spiritual rather than earthly means. These occult intelligence operations were often remarkably sophisticated, involving the creation of fabricated prophecies and omens designed to manipulate royal decision-making in directions that served particular political interests. The corruption of royal record-keeping for political purposes became a crucial element of court intrigue, with various factions working to alter, destroy, or fabricate official documents to support their political objectives. Chronicles, legal records, financial accounts, and diplomatic correspondence were all subject to systematic manipulation by court officials serving different masters. The control of information meant control of political narrative, making the royal archives battlegrounds where competing factions fought to shape historical records that could justify their actions and discredit their enemies. Marriage negotiations became elaborate intelligence operations as royal courts sought to gather detailed information about potential alliance partners while concealing their own kingdom's weaknesses and problems. The lengthy process of royal marriage negotiations provided perfect cover for extensive espionage operations, with marriage envoys serving as intelligence agents, gathering information about foreign military capabilities, economic resources, political stability, and potential vulnerabilities. These matrimonial intelligence operations often revealed more strategic information than traditional diplomatic or military reconnaissance. The development of coded communications and secret writing systems allowed medieval conspirators to coordinate complex plots across vast distances while maintaining plausible deniability if their messages were intercepted. Royal courts became centers for cryptographic innovation as various factions developed increasingly sophisticated methods for concealing their communications from rival intelligence networks. The interception and decryption of coded messages became a crucial element of court security, with competing factions employing mathematicians, linguists, and even early computer-like devices to break enemy codes while protecting their own communications. The psychological warfare employed in medieval court intrigue often proved more devastating than physical violence, as skilled manipulators used carefully crafted rumors, false evidence, and social pressure to destroy their enemies' reputations and mental stability. The creation and spread of damaging gossip became a precision weapon that could destroy political careers and even royal dynasties without ever drawing a sword or firing an arrow. These psychological operations often targeted the families and associates of primary enemies, creating broad networks of collateral damage that could extend far beyond the original political conflicts. The international dimensions of court intrigue meant that domestic political disputes often became proxy conflicts between major European powers, with local factions receiving foreign funding, intelligence support, and even military assistance in their struggles against domestic rivals. The complexity of these international intrigue networks meant that seemingly local political conflicts were often actually battles in much larger strategic competitions between kingdoms and empires, with local participants serving as unwitting pawns in games whose stakes and rules they barely understood. The power struggles between church and crown in medieval Europe created some of the most complex and destructive political conflicts in human history, fundamentally reshaping both religious and secular authority across the continent. These weren't merely disputes over administrative details, but existential battles that determined whether spiritual or temporal power would ultimately govern human society. The stakes were so high and the competing claims so irreconcilable that these conflicts often escalated into open warfare, with both sides employing every available weapon from economic pressure and diplomatic manipulation to military conquest and systematic persecution. The intertwining of religious and political authority in medieval society meant that these battles affected every aspect of human life, from personal spiritual practices to international relations, creating fault lines that would influence European development for centuries. The investiture controversy between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV exemplified the devastating nature of church-crown conflicts, demonstrating how competing claims to ultimate authority could tear apart the fundamental structures of medieval society. The dispute ostensibly centered on the question of who had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials, but the underlying issue was whether the Pope or the Emperor held supreme authority over Christian Europe. The conflict escalated into a full-scale war that lasted for decades, with both sides excommunicating their enemies, deposing rival leaders, and encouraging rebellion against established authority. Henry IV's famous journey to Canossa, where he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days begging papal forgiveness, became a symbol of how these conflicts could humiliate even the most powerful secular rulers. The development of competing legal systems created practical nightmares for medieval subjects who found themselves subject to both canon law and secular law, often with contradictory requirements that made legal compliance impossible. Church courts claimed jurisdiction over moral issues, family matters, and anything involving clergy, while royal courts insisted on their authority over criminal matters, property disputes, and political crimes. This jurisdictional overlap meant that the same action could be legal under one system and criminal under another, leaving ordinary people trapped between competing authorities who demanded conflicting behaviors and loyalties. The murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral represented the ultimate escalation of church-crown conflicts, demonstrating how these power struggles could lead to shocking acts of violence that reverberated across centuries. Becket's transformation from Henry II's loyal chancellor to his most dangerous enemy illustrated how personal relationships could become casualties of larger institutional conflicts. When 4 knights, believing they were acting on Henry's wishes, murdered the archbishop in his own cathedral, they committed an act so shocking that it fundamentally altered the balance of power between church and state across Europe. The immediate canonization of Becket and the establishment of his shrine as a major pilgrimage destination turned the murdered archbishop into a permanent symbol of royal tyranny and church martyrdom. Economic warfare between church and crown reached staggering proportions as both institutions sought to control the vast wealth generated by medieval society. The church's exemption from taxation created fundamental tensions with royal authorities who needed revenue to finance their governments and armies, but found huge portions of their kingdom's wealth legally beyond their reach. Kings responded by attempting to tax church property indirectly, imposing fees on church activities, and demanding military service from religious institutions that claimed spiritual exemption from secular obligations. These economic conflicts often escalated into broader political crises as both sides sought to demonstrate their ultimate authority over material resources. The Babylonian captivity of the papacy, when French pressure forced the papal court to relocate from Rome to Avignon, represented perhaps the most successful example of royal power successfully subordinating church authority to secular political interests. For nearly 70 years, the Pope effectively became a puppet of French royal policy, issuing bulls and making decisions that served French strategic interests rather than broader Christian spiritual needs. This period demonstrated that even the highest spiritual authority in Christendom could be reduced to a political tool when faced with sufficient secular pressure, fundamentally undermining papal claims to independence from temporal power. The Great Western Schism that followed the Avignon period created an even more devastating crisis as competing papal claimants excommunicated each other and demanded that Christian Europe choose sides in what was essentially a political dispute disguised as a spiritual conflict. The existence of multiple simultaneous popes, each claiming divine authority and condemning their rivals as heretics, destroyed the unity of Christian Europe and forced every king, noble, and institution to make political calculations disguised as theological decisions. This schism revealed how thoroughly politicized the highest levels of church authority had become, with spiritual leadership subordinated to dynastic and national interests. The Crusades represented the most destructive fusion of religious and political authority, as church and crown cooperated to channel domestic violence and political ambition into foreign conquest, justified by spiritual rhetoric. These conflicts weren't primarily religious endeavors, but elaborate military expeditions designed to serve the political interests of both secular and religious leaders, while providing outlets for the violent tendencies of medieval nobility. The systematic slaughter of Muslim and Jewish populations during the Crusades, conducted under religious banners with explicit papal blessing, demonstrated how spiritual authority could be weaponized to justify virtually any level of brutality when it served political objectives. Heresy prosecutions became weapons in church-crown power struggles, as both sides sought to eliminate political enemies by branding them as spiritual threats to Christian society. The Inquisition, ostensibly designed to protect church doctrine, quickly became a tool for persecuting political opponents and seizing their property for redistribution to political allies. The arbitrary nature of heresy charges, combined with the use of torture to extract confessions and the seizure of accused heretics' property, created a system of legalized terrorism that both church and crown authorities used to eliminate opposition and finance their operations. The control of education became a crucial battleground between church and crown, as both sides understood that shaping young minds meant controlling future political and religious leadership. Monastic schools and cathedral universities taught curricula designed to produce clergy loyal to church authority, while royal courts established alternative educational institutions intended to train administrators and advisors whose primary loyalty would be to secular rather than religious authority. This educational competition created parallel intellectual traditions that often contradicted each other, leaving students confused about fundamental questions of authority and allegiance. Marriage and family law became particular flashpoints in church-crown conflicts, as both institutions claimed ultimate authority over these most personal aspects of human life. The Church's insistence on spiritual authority over marriage contracts conflicted with royal claims that marriage alliances were political matters requiring secular approval. Divorce and annulment proceedings became political battlefields where church and crown authorities maneuvered to serve their institutional interests, while families were torn apart by competing legal systems that offered contradictory guidance about fundamental life decisions. The appointment of bishops and abbots created systematic conflicts, as church authorities demanded spiritual independence, while royal governments insisted that religious leaders who controlled vast territories and resources must serve secular political interests. The compromise solutions that emerged often satisfied neither side, creating religious leaders who were torn between competing loyalties and unable to serve effectively in either spiritual or political roles. These divided loyalties contributed to the corruption of both church and state institutions, as religious and secular officials sought to avoid conflicts by accommodating both sides through various forms of compromise that often involved corruption and abuse of authority. The development of separate church and royal bureaucracies created competing power structures that duplicated functions and created endless opportunities for conflict and confusion. Both church and crown maintained their own diplomatic services, legal systems, military forces, and financial institutions, often working at cross purposes and creating inefficiencies that drained resources from both institutions. The existence of parallel power structures meant that medieval society was constantly navigating between competing authorities that claimed ultimate jurisdiction over the same territories and populations. The international dimensions of church-crown conflicts meant that these disputes often became proxy wars between different kingdoms, with religious authority being manipulated to serve national political interests. The Pope's ability to place entire kingdoms under interdict, prohibiting religious services and spiritual care, became a weapon in international relations that could be used to pressure secular rulers into political compliance. Similarly, royal authorities used their influence over local church appointments to advance diplomatic objectives and undermine foreign political interests through religious manipulation. The common people paid the highest price for these elite power struggles between church and crown, finding themselves subject to competing tax systems, conflicting legal requirements, and contradictory moral teachings that made normal life increasingly difficult and dangerous. Peasants and townspeople were forced to choose sides in conflicts they barely understood, facing persecution from whichever authority they failed to support adequately while receiving little protection from the side they chose to favor. The suffering of common people under medieval royal rule reached levels that are difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective, as entire populations lived in conditions that can only be described as systematic oppression, designed to extract maximum wealth and labor from human beings while providing minimal protection or support in return. The feudal system wasn't merely an economic arrangement, but a comprehensive system of human exploitation that treated the vast majority of the population as property owned by their social superiors, with no rights, no legal protections, and no hope of improving their circumstances through legitimate means. Medieval peasants, who comprised roughly 90% of the population, lived lives that were typically brief, brutal, and filled with suffering that served the luxury and ambition of their royal and noble masters. The tax burden imposed on common people by royal governments reached confiscatory levels that often left families without enough resources to survive even modest hardships. Kings routinely demanded not just money, but labor, crops, livestock, and even military service from subjects who were already struggling to maintain basic subsistence. The complexity of medieval tax systems, which included feudal obligations, church tithes, royal levies, and various local assessments, meant that peasants often found themselves paying more in taxes than they earned through their labor, forcing them into cycles of debt and dependency that lasted for generations. When harvest failures or other disasters struck, the inflexible nature of royal taxation meant that families starved while tax collectors continued to demand payment of obligations based on theoretical rather than actual ability to pay. Military conscription represented one of the cruelest aspects of royal rule, as kings routinely forced peasant men to abandon their families and farms to fight in wars that served no purpose beyond advancing royal ambition and territorial claims. These conscripted soldiers were typically poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and treated as expendable cannon fodder whose deaths were acceptable casualties in the pursuit of royal glory. The absence of conscripted men from their communities created economic hardship for their families, while weakening entire regions' ability to maintain agricultural production and defend against local threats. Many conscripted peasants never returned home, dying in foreign campaigns that brought no benefit to their communities, while leaving their wives and children destitute and defenseless. The legal system under medieval royal rule provided virtually no protection for common people, who found themselves subject to arbitrary punishment and exploitation by royal officials, with little recourse for justice or protection. Peasants accused of crimes, whether guilty or innocent, faced legal procedures that were biased against them from the beginning, with judges who were typically royal appointees more concerned with demonstrating their authority than determining truth or providing fair treatment. The use of trial by ordeal, torture to extract confessions, and collective punishment for individual crimes created a legal environment where common people lived in constant fear of arbitrary persecution for acts they might not have committed or even understood to be illegal. Land tenure systems kept peasants bound to specific territories owned by nobles and ultimately by the crown, creating a form of legalized slavery that prevented social mobility and geographic freedom. Serfs could not leave their assigned lands without permission from their lords, could not marry without approval, and could not pursue alternative occupations even if they possessed skills that might allow them to improve their circumstances. This system of bound labor ensured a steady supply of workers for royal and noble estates, while trapping entire families in cycles of poverty and dependency that could last for centuries. Royal justice was dispensed primarily for the benefit of the ruling class, with common people receiving harsh punishment for minor infractions, while nobles faced minimal consequences for serious crimes against peasant victims. A peasant who stole food to feed his starving family could face execution or mutilation, while a noble who raped peasant women or murdered peasant men might receive nothing more than a fine that represented pocket change compared to their wealth. This double standard of justice reinforced the fundamental inequality of medieval society while demonstrating to common people that their lives had little value in the eyes of their royal masters. The royal monopoly on violence meant that peasants had no legal means of defending themselves against abuse by nobles, royal officials, or even common criminals who enjoyed protection from higher authorities. Self-defense was often treated as rebellion against royal authority, with peasants who fought back against oppression facing far harsher punishment than their original oppressors. This systematic disarmament of the common population ensured that royal and noble violence faced no meaningful resistance, while creating an environment where ordinary people lived in constant vulnerability to predation by their social superiors. Economic exploitation reached systematic levels as royal policies consistently favored noble and clerical interests over the needs of common people who produced the wealth that supported medieval society. Price controls, trade restrictions, and currency manipulations were routinely used to transfer wealth from peasant producers to royal treasuries and noble estates, with no consideration given to the impact of these policies on the people who actually performed the labor that made economic activity possible. Royal monopolies on essential goods like salt, iron, and grain created artificial scarcities that forced common people to pay inflated prices for necessities, while generating enormous profits for royal and noble monopoly holders. The destruction caused by royal wars fell disproportionately on common people, whose homes, crops, and livestock became targets for opposing armies seeking to damage their enemies' economic base. Peasant communities found themselves caught between competing military forces, with both sides treating civilian populations as legitimate targets for violence and exploitation. The practice of living off the land during military campaigns meant that armies routinely seized food, animals, and other resources from peasant communities, leaving entire regions impoverished and vulnerable to famine and disease. Royal building projects consumed enormous resources extracted from common people who received no benefit from the palaces, castles, and monuments that their labor and taxes made possible. The construction of royal residences often required the forced labor of thousands of peasants who were compelled to abandon their own economic activities to serve royal vanity projects. These building campaigns frequently lasted for decades, creating sustained drains on regional resources while demonstrating the fundamental disconnect between royal priorities and the needs of the people who actually supported royal power through their labor and taxation. The royal court's consumption of luxury goods created artificial demand for expensive imports that were purchased with wealth extracted from peasant communities struggling with basic subsistence needs. Royal appetite for exotic foods, expensive clothing, precious metals, and foreign luxuries created trade relationships that benefited merchants and nobles, while imposing additional tax burdens on common people who gained nothing from these international economic relationships. The conspicuous consumption of royal courts served primarily to demonstrate wealth and power rather than fulfill any productive economic or social function. Religious obligations imposed by royal authorities created additional burdens for common people who were required to support not only secular government, but also elaborate church hierarchies that served royal interests rather than genuine spiritual needs. The construction of cathedrals, monasteries, and other religious institutions consumed resources that could have been used to improve living conditions for common people, while the maintenance of large clerical establishments created ongoing financial obligations that further strained peasant resources. The psychological impact of living under absolute royal authority created populations characterized by learned helplessness, chronic fear, and acceptance of suffering that would be considered intolerable in modern societies. Generation after generation of common people grew up knowing that their lives were subject to the arbitrary whims of distant rulers who viewed them as resources to be exploited rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and protection. This psychological oppression was perhaps even more damaging than the physical hardships imposed by royal rule, creating cultures of servility and dependence that made resistance to oppression virtually impossible to organize or sustain. Justice in medieval royal courts represented one of the most corrupted and oppressive aspects of royal power, transforming what should have been a system for protecting the innocent and maintaining social order into a mechanism for enriching royal officials, eliminating political enemies, and demonstrating the absolute power of royal authority over life and death. The concept of equal treatment under law was completely alien to medieval legal systems, which operated on the explicit assumption that different classes of people deserved different forms of justice based on their social status, wealth, and relationship to royal authority. This systematic inequality created legal environments where outcomes were determined not by evidence, legal precedent, or moral considerations, but by political calculations, personal relationships, and the ability of involved parties to purchase favorable treatment from corrupt officials. The sale of judicial positions meant that many medieval courts were presided over by individuals whose primary qualification was their ability to pay for their appointments, rather than any knowledge of law, commitment to justice, or personal integrity. These purchased judgeships were understood to be business investments expected to generate profits through various forms of legal corruption, including accepting bribes for favorable verdicts, imposing excessive fines that could be reduced for additional payments, and creating artificial legal complications that required expensive resolution. The systematic commercialization of judicial authority meant that court proceedings often resembled elaborate auctions where justice was sold to the highest bidder rather than legal processes designed to determine truth or provide fair resolution of disputes. Torture was routinely employed not to extract truth, but to produce whatever confessions or testimony would serve the political interests of royal authorities, creating a system where legal proceedings became elaborate theatrical performances designed to justify predetermined outcomes. The techniques used in medieval torture were specifically designed to maximize pain and psychological trauma while keeping victims alive long enough to provide whatever statements their torturers required. The legal presumption that confessions extracted under torture were valid evidence created a system where anyone accused of crimes against royal authority faced the choice between confession to crimes they might not have committed or prolonged agony that would likely end in death regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Trial by ordeal represented perhaps the most absurd aspect of medieval justice, with legal outcomes determined by religious rituals that had no connection to actual guilt or innocence, but provided convenient ways for authorities to justify whatever verdicts served their political purposes. Whether someone survived being thrown into water while bound, successfully carried red-hot iron without being burned, or recovered quickly from deliberately inflicted wounds was supposed to indicate divine judgment about their guilt or innocence. In practice, these ordeals were often manipulated by court officials who controlled the conditions under which they were conducted, allowing authorities to produce whatever results they desired while maintaining the fiction that outcomes represented divine rather than human judgment. The use of collective punishment meant that entire communities could be held responsible for the crimes of individual members, creating legal systems where royal authorities could devastate entire populations in response to single acts of resistance or rebellion. When peasants in particular regions showed insufficient loyalty or failed to meet tax obligations, royal officials often imposed punishment on entire villages, including the seizure of property, mass executions, and the destruction of homes and crops that left entire communities destitute. This collective responsibility created climates of mutual surveillance and suspicion as community members understood that their neighbors' actions could result in punishment for everyone. Legal procedures were deliberately designed to be incomprehensible to common people, with court proceedings conducted in Latin or other languages that defendants couldn't understand, using legal concepts and procedures that had no relationship to common experience or logic. This systematic exclusion of defendants from understanding their own legal proceedings meant that most people accused of crimes had no meaningful opportunity to defend themselves or even understand what they were being accused of. The complexity of legal language and procedure served to mystify judicial authority while ensuring that only wealthy individuals who could afford educated legal representation had any realistic chance of receiving favorable treatment in royal courts. The speed of medieval justice often meant that accused individuals faced execution or severe punishment within days or even hours of their arrest, with no meaningful opportunity to gather evidence, locate witnesses, or prepare any kind of defense against the charges they faced. This rapid processing of legal cases was designed to demonstrate royal power and deter future challenges to royal authority rather than ensure accurate determination of guilt or innocence. The fear of immediate and severe punishment created environments where people avoided any behavior that might be interpreted as challenging royal authority, even when such behavior was perfectly legal and morally justified. Appeals processes were either non-existent or controlled by the same authorities who had made original legal decisions, making meaningful review of unjust verdicts virtually impossible for anyone who lacked powerful political connections or enormous financial resources. The absence of independent appellate review meant that legal errors, corrupt decisions, and politically motivated verdicts typically became final regardless of their impact on innocent victims. This lack of meaningful review created systems where initial legal decisions carried enormous weight regardless of their accuracy or fairness. The seizure of property from convicted criminals often appeared to be the primary motivation for legal proceedings, with accusations specifically chosen to justify confiscation of valuable assets that could enrich royal treasuries or reward political allies. Many legal cases seem designed primarily to transfer wealth from accused individuals to royal authorities rather than address actual criminal behavior or protect public safety. The financial incentives created by property seizure laws meant that royal officials had personal interests in securing convictions regardless of actual evidence or the real guilt or innocence of accused parties. Legal immunity enjoyed by royal officials meant that the people responsible for administering justice were themselves beyond the reach of legal accountability, creating systems where the worst legal abuses were committed by the very individuals supposedly responsible for maintaining legal order. Royal judges, prosecutors, and enforcement officials could commit virtually any crime against common people with impunity, knowing that their positions protected them from legal consequences regardless of how egregious their behavior. This immunity for legal officials created environments where the justice system became a source of injustice rather than protection for ordinary citizens. The intersection of secular and religious law created additional opportunities for legal manipulation, as authorities could choose whichever legal system provided the most favorable jurisdiction for their purposes, while ignoring alternative legal frameworks that might provide better protection for accused individuals. The ability to forum shop between different legal systems meant that prosecution authorities could virtually guarantee favorable outcomes by selecting the most advantageous legal environment for their cases, while defendants had no corresponding ability to choose legal frameworks that might provide better protection for their rights. The use of legal proceedings for political purposes meant that criminal law became a weapon for eliminating political enemies, rather than a system for protecting public safety and maintaining social order. Accusations of treason, heresy, and other political crimes were routinely fabricated to justify the elimination of individuals who posed threats to royal authority, with legal proceedings serving as elaborate theatrical productions designed to provide legitimacy for predetermined political outcomes. This politicization of criminal law meant that legal institutions lost their credibility as neutral arbiters of justice and became identified with royal oppression rather than public protection. The price of absolute power for medieval monarchs went far beyond the suffering they inflicted on their subjects, creating psychological, social, and spiritual costs that often destroyed the very individuals who wielded such tremendous authority over their fellow human beings. The isolation, paranoia, and moral corruption that accompanied absolute power produced rulers who were often as much victims of the royal system as the people they oppressed, trapped in roles that demanded behaviors and attitudes that were fundamentally incompatible with human psychological health and social well-being. The absolute nature of medieval royal power created environments where normal human relationships became impossible, where trust was a liability that could prove fatal, and where the natural human capacity for empathy and connection became dangerous weaknesses that successful rulers had to systematically eliminate from their personalities. The psychological isolation experienced by absolute monarchs was perhaps the most profound cost of wielding unlimited power, as the concentration of life and death authority in the hands of a single individual inevitably separated that person from normal human relationships and authentic emotional connections. Medieval kings and queens lived surrounded by people whose livelihoods and often whose lives depended on maintaining royal favor, creating environments where genuine friendship, honest feedback, and authentic emotional support were virtually impossible to find. Every relationship became transactional. Every conversation potentially carried hidden agendas, and every expression of affection might mask elaborate schemes for personal advancement or political manipulation. The constant threat of assassination, poisoning, and betrayal created chronic states of paranoia and hypervigilance that made normal psychological functioning impossible for medieval rulers who understood that any momentary lapse in suspicion could result in their deaths. The need to constantly evaluate the motives of everyone around them, from family members to trusted advisors to household servants, created mental states characterized by chronic stress, sleeplessness, and the inability to experience genuine relaxation or peace. This constant vigilance often led to psychological breakdowns, with many medieval rulers displaying symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, paranoid delusions, and post-traumatic stress responses. The moral corruption required to maintain absolute power forced medieval rulers to participate in or authorize actions that were fundamentally incompatible with basic human moral instincts, creating internal psychological conflicts that often manifested in various forms of mental illness, addiction, and self-destructive behavior. The systematic execution of potential rivals, the crushing of rebellions through mass violence, and the daily administration of a system that caused enormous suffering to innocent people required rulers to suppress their natural empathy and develop psychological mechanisms for justifying or ignoring the human cost of their decisions. This moral numbing often extended beyond political necessity into personal relationships, creating rulers who became incapable of genuine emotional connection or moral reasoning in any area of their lives. The burden of ultimate responsibility for the welfare of entire kingdoms created levels of psychological pressure that were often literally unbearable for medieval rulers who understood that their decisions could result in the deaths of thousands or the collapse of entire civilizations. The weight of such responsibility, combined with the impossibility of making decisions that would satisfy all competing interests and needs, often led to decision paralysis, depression, and various forms of escapist behavior, including alcoholism, sexual excess, and obsessive engagement in trivial pursuits that provided temporary relief from the crushing awareness of their ultimate accountability for enormous human suffering. The dynastic pressure to produce heirs while maintaining political marriages that were often loveless and sometimes actively hostile created profound personal unhappiness for medieval rulers who found their most intimate relationships subordinated to political calculation and strategic necessity. The inability to choose their own romantic partners, combined with the constant scrutiny of their personal relationships and the political implications of every private interaction, often left rulers emotionally stunted and unable to experience genuine intimacy or personal satisfaction in their private lives. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of stress, as rulers understood that their personal happiness and even their survival might depend on biological processes largely beyond their control. The religious dimensions of medieval royal authority created spiritual and psychological burdens, as rulers struggled to reconcile their claims to divine authority with their awareness of their own moral failures and the suffering caused by their rule. The requirement to present themselves as divinely chosen leaders while privately understanding their own human limitations and moral compromises created profound psychological tensions that often manifested in various forms of religious obsession, self-flagellation, and desperate attempts to purchase divine forgiveness through elaborate religious donations and ceremonies that served more as psychological therapy than genuine spiritual practice. The education and childhood experiences of medieval royal heirs created profound psychological damage that prepared them for lives of isolation, mistrust, and moral compromise from their earliest years. Royal children grew up knowing that their siblings were potential rivals who might need to be eliminated, that their friends and companions might be spies or future enemies, and that their personal desires and preferences were subordinate to dynastic and political necessities that would determine every major aspect of their lives. This childhood preparation for absolute power often produced adults who were psychologically incapable of normal human relationships and emotionally stunted in ways that made effective leadership extremely difficult. The physical health costs of royal life, including the effects of chronic stress, constant fear of poisoning leading to dietary restrictions and malnutrition, and the inability to engage in normal physical activity due to security concerns, often left medieval rulers suffering from various chronic illnesses that further compromised their ability to make sound decisions and maintain psychological stability. The combination of poor physical health with extreme psychological pressure created conditions where many rulers were essentially invalids, attempting to govern complex societies while dealing with their own severe health problems. The legacy awareness that plagued many medieval rulers created additional psychological burdens as they understood that their actions would be judged by history and that their reputations would affect their children and descendants for generations. The desire for positive historical legacy often conflicted with the practical necessities of maintaining power in brutal political environments, creating internal tensions between rulers' desire to be remembered as good and just leaders and their understanding that survival often required them to authorize actions that would be condemned by future generations. The social isolation experienced by royal families extended beyond the rulers themselves to include their children, spouses, and close relatives who found themselves trapped in the same systems of mistrust, political calculation, and moral compromise that characterized royal courts. The inability to form normal social relationships affected entire royal family systems, creating dynasties characterized by emotional dysfunction, interpersonal violence, and the systematic destruction of normal family bonds in service of political necessity. The ultimate futility of absolute power became apparent to many medieval rulers, who discovered that their tremendous authority over others provided little actual control over their own lives, their personal happiness, or their ultimate fate. Despite wielding the power of life and death over millions of people, medieval kings and queens often found themselves as trapped and controlled by circumstances as their humblest subjects, unable to escape the demands of their positions or find genuine satisfaction in lives devoted to maintaining power systems that consumed everything they valued about their own humanity. The financial costs of maintaining absolute power often left even the wealthiest kingdoms in chronic debt, as the expense of royal courts, military forces, and administrative systems required to maintain royal authority consumed resources faster than even the most efficient taxation systems could generate them. The irony of absolute rulers who controlled vast territories but lived in constant financial crisis revealed the fundamental inefficiency and unsustainability of political systems based on the concentration of power in the hands of individuals rather than institutions designed to serve broader social needs. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark corridors of medieval royal power, we're left with a sobering understanding of how absolute authority corrupts not just those who wield it, but entire societies organized around the principle that some human beings are born to rule over others. The medieval period stands as a testament to the dangers of concentrated power, revealing how systems that place unlimited authority in the hands of individuals inevitably produce suffering, corruption, and social dysfunction on massive scales. The royal courts we've explored tonight weren't aberrations or exceptions to medieval norms, but logical consequences of political systems that rejected the fundamental equality of human beings in favor of hierarchies based on birth, violence, and the ability to maintain power through fear and oppression. The lessons from medieval royal history remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions about power, authority, and the proper relationship between rulers and the ruled. The systematic abuses we've documented tonight didn't emerge from the personal failings of individual monarchs, but from institutional structures that concentrated power without accountability, created incentives for corruption and abuse, and treated human beings as resources to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of dignity and protection. Understanding these historical patterns helps us recognize similar dangers in our own time and appreciate the value of political systems designed to prevent the concentration of absolute power in the hands of any individual or small group. The price of absolute power, as medieval history so clearly demonstrates, is ultimately paid not just by subjects who suffer under tyrannical rule, but by entire civilizations that sacrifice their potential for human flourishing on the altar of individual ambition and dynastic pride. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.